Yeah, I think I got another Incredibles video in me, why not? You're gonna listen to me ramble anyway, it might as well be about one of my favorite movies. You're probably looking at this video's title and saying to yourself, solving the Incredibles timeline? I thought the timeline was already solved years ago. And you wouldn't be completely wrong about that. For over 2 decades now, most people have been content with placing the Incredibles anywhere in the 1960s, 1970s, or most commonly and specifically, 1962. This is the commonly agreed upon year that Incredibles 1 takes place in, with the end of the superhero glory days being placed sometime around the late 1940s. Specifically 1947. This matches the 15-year time gap between the banning of superhero activity and the end of the time skip. It also just makes sense visually, as The Incredibles has a very distinct 1960s retrofuturistic aesthetic, as confirmed by director Brad Bird and others who worked in the production design for Incredibles 1 and its sequel.
This film is set in a sort of an alternate universe, mid-60s world.
The original film was kind of a 50s-ish aesthetic. We wanted to push it forward a bit to 62-ish.
Not to mention the detail that pretty much outright confirms The Incredibles takes place in 1962 can be found when Bob is reading the newspaper and finds out about Gazer Beam's disappearance. Zooming in on the newspaper confirms that the date is May 16th, 1962. So, case closed, right? Not exactly. As much as I love The Incredibles and how I think it's one of the best movies ever made, it's clear that not as much care was put into making the timeline make a ton of sense. Which, fair enough, the movies and their stories should come first, especially since the Incredibles franchise doesn't really put that much focus on its lore outside of optional material. Cough cough, the NSA tapes, cough cough. But this hurts my agenda of The Incredibles being a perfectly written movie, so I'm not happy, Bob, not happy. While we may have an exact date that more or less confirms the year the film takes place in, there are several small details and inconsistencies about the rest of the Incredibles timeline that have been driving me insane for years now, and I don't really see anyone bringing them up. Now, a lesser person would just write these off as plot holes or contrivances and leave it at that, but my problem is that I'm not normal. So I wanted to lay out everything I could gather about the Incredibles timeline, whether it makes sense or not, and see if I can either find ways to fit it into the commonly accepted 1962 timeline, or if I can possibly BS my way through a completely made up timeline that takes some creative liberties with the errors I find. I also just find talking about this stuff interesting, and I encourage you to soak up all of this information and try and create your own timeline if you disagree with where mine goes. So let's just jump straight into it. The Incredibles timeline that most people are familiar with goes as such. In 1947, Mr. Incredible and Elastigirl, or Bob and Helen, both get married. That's not the most important detail. Mr. Incredible is sued by Oliver Sandsweet after preventing his attempted suicide at the cost of accidentally injuring the man with significant damage to his neck.
Hey, I saved your life! You didn't save my life, you ruined my step!
While it isn't stated if this lawsuit was successful, this was only the beginning. On that same night, Mr. Incredible saved the train from crashing and potentially killing multiple people on board at the cost of severely injuring a lot of people. The class action lawsuit filed by people who were injured on the train is implied to have been successful and cost the United States government millions of dollars. And after Mr. Incredible was sued, the public became far more comfortable with filing lawsuits against superheroes and holding them accountable for the damage they cause on a daily basis. This would lead to the government launching the Superhero Relocation Program and finally banning superhero activity. Then 15 years passed in 1962 and the events of Incredibles 1 play out, with Incredibles 2 starting exactly where Incredibles 1 ended. Apologies for the brief plot summary, but it's needed so we can jump straight into the specifics. This timeline, when explained like this, makes complete sense. It's solid and not very complicated to understand. It's when you decide to look into all of the events that happened in between this 15-year time skip that things start to get a little bit shaky. The most apparent issue lies with the dates given by Edna Mode when discussing many of the supers who died due to cape malfunctions. When you're watching the movie, this is a very darkly comedic scene, and it's easy to get too swept up in finding it funny and forgetting that the dates Edna gives don't make a ton of sense if you believe superhero activity was banned in 1947. While we don't know the exact dates of every hero who died due to a cape malfunction, we do know the exact dates for Thunderhead and Stratigale.
November 15th to 58. His cape snagged on a missile.
Thunderhead died on November 15th, 1958, which if you haven't noticed, is a full 11 years after 1947, and the implied date that superheroes were made illegal. This raises a few questions, like how is Thunderhead casually fighting supervillains and saving people in costume when superheroes are supposed to be illegal? Is he resuming hero work behind the government's back? That wouldn't make much sense given, according to the NSA tapes, the government was very aware of his death and Edna seems to know as well. We do know that Thunderhead isn't exactly the brightest person, so you could make the excuse he's doing this because he doesn't know any better and doesn't really care about the consequences if he's caught. But that excuse definitely doesn't apply to Stratigale. Despite being a teenager, she's far from stupid, and yet...
April 23rd, 57. Cape caught in a jet turbine.
Strategale died on April 23rd, 1957, over a year before Thunderhead. I highly doubt that these two were both doing hero work behind the government's back, especially given they're in costume and spotted by civilians. Strategale flies up to a plane just to wave at people. She's making her presence known on purpose. If these two were both doing this once supers were outlawed, then I think the government would have caught on and arrested them by now. And let's not forget, there were superheroes present at Bob and Helen's wedding who were close friends with them. You want to know who they were? Dynaguy, Thunderhead, Strategale, and Metaman. Also Gazerbeam, but he doesn't die for a while. Ignoring the fact that Strategale is somehow still meant to be a teenager here, all four of these heroes died due to cape malfunctions in action, as explained by Edna. Meaning if all of these heroes died in action while superheroes were still legal, it had to have been after Bob and Helen's wedding. At the very least a couple of years after, to explain why Strategale and Thunderhead's deaths are a year apart. I find it unrealistic to think the legality of superheroes continued all the way from 1947 up until 1958, because, still assuming Incredibles 1 takes place in 1962, that would mean superheroes were only made illegal for about 4 years. And I don't think the film gives the impression that Bob suddenly became overweight, depressed, and in the middle of a midlife crisis after only 4 years without hero work. It saps a lot of the impact away from the time skip and makes his desperation less believable. There's also another detail that people tend to forget, and that's when Mr. Incredible searches for Elastigirl in Syndrome's computer. As stated on her file, Elastigirl was last spotted doing hero work in 1955, and it can be implied that this is when she decided to retire and settle down to raise her family alongside Bob. If we assume that superheroes are still legally doing hero work in the late 50s, I don't think this implies that supers were banned in 1955, and that this was just a conscious decision on Elastigirl's part. I think it also makes sense to place Violet's birth around this time, considering she's meant to be 14 by the events of Incredibles 1, and Helen doesn't strike me as the kind of character to resume hero work when she has a newborn baby to attend to. Oh, fuck you. I also think it's likely to assume Bob stopped hero work around the same time, likely pressured by Helen. So here's all the current possibilities. Heroes were banned in 1947 and remained banned for 15 years despite some heroes breaking the law to continue working quote-unquote secret. Hero lawsuits began in 1947, and after years of them being processed through court and more lawsuits piling on, they were banned anywhere between the mid to late 50s and then re-legalized in 1962. But then there's also the possibility that the superhero glory days actually took place throughout the 1940s and 1950s. The lawsuits began sometime around 1955 due to Elastigirl's retirement and supers being made illegal in the mid to late 50s, then re-legalized sometime around the 1970s. And then there's probably a bunch of other possibilities, but you get the picture. It's confusing. Even though we have a date for when Incredibles 1 takes place, it's hard to believe supers were really banned as late as 1958, because then it deflates the impact of the big 15-year time skip, and makes a lot of Bob's behavior more pathetic and less believable. Any possible timeline you can make from this information would still somewhat work, but you'd need to take massive leaps in your suspension of disbelief. I've also seen a handful of people, not many, but a handful, making the argument that the Incredibles can't take place anywhere between 1940 to 1970 because of the advancement in technology, which I think is a very silly conclusion to draw, given the Incredibles is fictional and is inspired by 60s retrofuturism. Their world is implied to be much more technologically advanced than ours. And I know I'm gonna sound like a hypocrite given I poked fun at Apogee's solar-powered suit in the NSA tapes video, which by the way, a lot of people tried to correct me on, but it says right on the wiki that Apogee's suit is solar-powered, so even if she doesn't get her powers from solar panels, you're wrong and I win the argument. So personally, I wouldn't get too hung up on stuff like Bob using a desktop computer during a time where they weren't even a thing, or Bob having a self-driving car in the 40s that has a built-in GPS and the ability to put clothes on him with incredible precision. Details like that don't really matter and don't impact the plot too much. Something that does bother me when it comes to reality is that it's very much implied the Incredibles takes place during the height of the Cold War. I mean, in the NSA tapes, Elastigirl straight up threatens to join the USSR if the NSA don't pay for her supersuits.
You know what? I got a good question. How come the NSA, the National Supers Association, isn't paying for my action wear, huh? I don't think you guys want me playing for any other team, do you?
Not directly, obviously, but it's certainly implied. So the United States noticing an unidentified flying object, in this case the Omnidroid, entering US airspace and landing in a populated city without trying to shoot it out of the sky seems very interesting, but that's more of a history nitpick than anything. And I mean, if we're still going on about errors, dear Incredibles 2, I find it unlikely that an episode of Johnny Quest is airing on TV in 1962, a full 2 years before it actually officially premiered, you fucking heathen. So clearly, there are a lot of inconsistencies and annoying little issues with the Incredibles timeline. If you still subscribe to the belief that the original film takes place in 1962, because really that one date in the newspaper is the only thing making all of this super difficult to believe, and it's unfortunately hard to argue against something like this. The film was made with a 60s aesthetic in mind, but consider for a second, and this is probably just me on massive copium here, but just consider the possibility, what if this detail doesn't actually matter? Logically speaking, it absolutely does, but if you want to arrange all of these events in a new timeline that makes sense, I don't think it's unreasonable to just view this newspaper date as a small detail detail just thrown in for detail's sake, and that it isn't actual concrete proof for the year Incredibles 1 takes place in. Small details like this newspaper date are included in movies all the time, and don't end up meaning much. It just holds a significant amount of importance to The Incredibles, because at no point in either of the movies do we see a single concrete date for the year they take place in, other than this one. This is all we have to go off of, and it isn't much. So if we were to ignore this date, and rely on the other years we have available, like the deaths of certain supers and Elastigirl's retirement for example, I think we can craft a much more believable timeline that would still result in the film's 60s aesthetic making total sense, even if we conclude that it doesn't take place in the 60s. You can gather all the information and come to your own conclusions if you want. After all, a lot of this is up to interpretation, and I encourage you to post your own timelines in the comments. But I think I have a good idea of when The Incredibles takes place, with all of the previous eras reinterpreted in ways that actually make sense. At the end of the day, it's likely the official timeline will remain in 1962, as that's the only date shown on screen, and I'm not trying to act like my timeline is better than what's officially considered canon. This is all just a bit of fun, alright? Okay, so first of all, let's go over the 1962 timeline again, the timeline that most people subscribe to. 1947, Bob and Helen get married right before a wave of lawsuits hit. These lawsuits result in the government officially banning superheroes and offering to relocate and protect them from being held accountable for past actions, so long as they never resume hero work again. Around this time, likely in 1948, Helen gives birth to Violet. In 1951 or 1952, Helen gives birth to Dash. November 18th, 1955, Helen officially retires as Elastigirl, implying she was continuing hero work illegally when she had kids to take care of, which seems to conflict a lot of her character in the first movie, but whatever, it still happened. April 23rd, 1957, teenage superhero Stratigale is killed while performing illegal hero work after her cape is caught in a jet turbine. November 15th, 1958, superhero Thunderhead is killed by performing illegal hero work after his cape is snagged on a missile fin, leaving his roommate Scott to take care of his adopted kids alone. May 16th, 1962, the events of Incredibles 1 begin, and given there's roughly a 2-month time skip from Bob defeating the first Omnidroid to encountering the next one, and the 3-month time skip to the end of the movie, it's safe to place the events of Incredibles 2 in October of 1962, given it picks up right where the first movie left off. This ends in supers being legalized roughly 10 days after the Underminer incident, which is just as unrealistic as it sounds, but that's just an Incredibles 2 problem. One of many. And that's a comprehensive breakdown of the 1962 timeline, warts and all. It's about as close to an officially canon timeline as you're gonna get. And now, here's my timeline. I've placed the events of my timeline from 1955 to 1970, and here's why. 1955, Bob and Helen get married right before a wave of lawsuits hit. Given how long it could take for lawsuits to go through court and just how many were filed, it can be safely assumed that the government banning of superheroes didn't just happen overnight, and was likely a process that took a few years to get going. After Bob was sued multiple times and cost the government millions of dollars, he either semi-consistently continued hero work while balancing his new responsibilities as a husband and soon-to-be father at Helen's request,
If we're gonna make this work, you gotta be more than Mr. Incredible. You know that.
or he decided to settle down alongside Helen on November 18th, 1955 to focus more on family and preparing to raise his kids. Around this time, likely in 1956, Violet Power was born. April 23rd, 1957, teenage superhero Stratigale is killed by performing hero work after her cape is caught in a jet turbine. As a side note, Stratigale being a teenager in 1957 now finally makes sense, and explains her teenage appearance at Bob and Helen's wedding, fixing a pretty large discrepancy of the 1962 timeline. I also think it's safe to assume that heroes have not been made completely illegal yet, which would explain why Stratigale is flying next to a plane in costume and trying to get people's attention. November 15th, 1958, superhero Thunderhead is killed by performing hero work after his cape is snagged on a missile fin, leaving his roommate Scott to take care of his adopted kids alone. Given this is the very last date we get for a superhero being killed, I'm willing to say supers were finally made illegal around 1958 to 1960. Around this time, likely anywhere between 1959 to 1960, Dash Parr was born, and then we jump up to 1970, where I believe the events of Incredibles 1 and 2 take place. It's 15 years on from 1955, it's the beginning of the 70s, so the 60s aesthetic still makes sense. If Bob did continue heroing past 1955 until they were banned, it presents a pretty big enough time gap to not make his behavior more unreasonable and petty, and when it comes to continuity errors, this fixes basically every one of them, including Johnny Quest. And when it comes to Incredibles 2, I'd still say the film takes place in October or sometime in autumn, given the kids are starting school again, so the re-legalization of supers happens in October of 1970, and that's my timeline. You can certainly definitely argue with it and maybe shift some dates around, but I think 1955 to 1970 is a very solid time frame that solves pretty much every continuity issue without making the events in the main story more complicated. This would of course mean that the 1962 date shown on Bob's newspaper is now considered an error if you believe this timeline, but I think ignoring one small date on a newspaper in order to fix every single issue of the timeline without placing it too far away from the 60s is a very worthwhile trade. And there you go, those were my insane ramblings about the Incredibles timeline. But please do let me know if you agree or disagree, and feel free to post your own timelines in the comments. It's not often I get to talk about the Incredibles, and seeing how much everyone still loves this film and loves talking about it all these years later is awesome. And remember, even if you do believe in my timeline over the 1962 timeline, it's worth noting that the 1962 timeline is likely closer to what Brad Bird had in mind, and what is officially considered canon. Warts and all. Just because there's discrepancies doesn't make it not canon. I just thought it'd be fun to take these discrepancies and see if I can somehow craft a timeline out of them that still makes sense. Anyway, thanks for watching, that's the end of the video, play Yakuza or something.